It was an ordinary Tuesday morning at First National Bank. The hum of the air conditioning, the soft rustling of paper, and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards set the tone for yet another day of uneventful transactions. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, but otherwise, the place was just like any other small, corporate bank, nothing to excite, nothing to challenge the monotony of routine. Jake, the security guard, was used to the quiet. He wasn't new to this job, having been assigned to patrol the building for the past 6 months after a stint as a local cop. He didn't mind the routine, it gave him the time to think. But that Tuesday, something felt different. Maybe it was the unusual chill in the air, or the faint tension he could feel in the atmosphere. Whatever it was, Jake brushed it aside. He had a job to do. Jake made his rounds like clockwork, checking the doors, walking past the tellers, giving a friendly nod to his colleagues who sat behind desks, busy with their own tasks. The bank had a few regular customers, mostly elderly folks withdrawing their pensions or business owners making deposits. There was nothing remarkable about them, and that was exactly how Jake liked it. The fewer the disruptions, the better. He was just walking past the waiting area when he noticed him, the man who would soon turn his life upside down. An elderly man had entered the bank, looking somewhat lost, but it was his appearance that caught Jake's attention. He wasn't wearing a suit, like the usual well-dressed customers, or a casual blazer, like some of the businessmen who came in. Instead, the man wore a simple denim jacket, his silver hair slightly tousled, and his face was marked with the kind of age and experience that hinted at a past full of stories. He looked out of place. At first glance, Jake assumed he was just another retiree coming to the bank to withdraw some cash. But something about the way the man moved, calm, deliberate, but with a quiet authority, made Jake hesitate. The elderly man seemed to be heading straight for a secure area, where only authorized personnel were allowed. Jake furrowed his brow, his instincts kicking in. Was this guy trying to sneak into the vault? He hadn't seen him around before, and he didn't look like he belonged. Without a second thought, Jake approached him. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the restricted area." The elderly man stopped, raising an eyebrow. "I'm just here to check something," he said, his voice calm but firm. Jake's suspicion flared. Check something? He didn't recognize him, and that was enough to trigger his security training. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You don't have authorization to be in there." The old man's face softened, as if he'd heard this kind of thing 1,000 times before. "Look, son, I'm just here to visit. You can call the manager if you'd like." Jake wasn't in the mood to entertain any nonsense. He had a job to do, and if this man wasn't going to listen, then it was his responsibility to remove him from the premises. "I'm going to have to escort you out, sir," Jake said firmly. The old man raised his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes seemed to twinkle with a hidden amusement. All right, I get it. "I'll go," he said with a chuckle, his voice dry as the desert. Jake didn't back down, leading the man out of the secure area and toward the exit. As he walked, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off, but he ignored it. "It's just another old guy causing trouble," he told himself. "He'll be fine once he's out the door." The elderly man complied, walking slowly but without resistance. Jake watched him exit, not giving him a second thought as he returned to his post. But as soon as the door shut behind the man, the tension in the air grew. A few minutes passed, and then the bank manager, Mrs. Thompson, appeared. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. She marched toward Jake, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and stopped just short of him. "Jake," she said, her voice sharp. "What did you just do?" Jake blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. "What do you mean?" "I escorted that man out. He wasn't supposed to be in the secure area." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief. "That man," she said, pausing as if trying to collect herself, "was Clint Eastwood. You just kicked out one of our major investors." Jake froze, his mouth going dry. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. The legendary actor. The icon. He blinked again, feeling his heart race. Wait, what? Yes, Jake, Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice strained. Clint Eastwood is an owner of this bank. He's been a silent investor for years, and you just kicked him out. Jake felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. I didn't know, he stammered, his mind racing. How could I have not recognized him? Mrs. Thompson shook her head, her disappointment clear. You need to fix this, Jake. And fast. Do you have any idea what you've done? Jake could barely hear her words over the pounding of his heart. He couldn't believe it. Clint Eastwood. The name kept replaying in his mind like an echo. This was the man who had shaped the history of American cinema, and he had just been unceremoniously thrown out of the building by Jake, of all people. Get yourself together, Mrs. Thompson snapped, before turning on her heel and walking away. Jake stood there, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him. His pulse hammered in his ears. He had just ruined everything. For a moment, Jake considered running after the man, apologizing, trying to make it right. But what could he possibly say to Clint Eastwood? Sorry, Mr. Eastwood, I didn't recognize you. I thought you were just another old man trying to sneak into a restricted area. My bad. The thought made Jake's stomach twist. As he stood frozen in place, staring blankly at the floor, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his wife, don't forget, Jake. Pick up the kids after work. Love you. The text felt like a slap in the face. How could he focus on picking up his kids when his entire life had just unraveled? He had just kicked out one of the most famous men in the world. And to make matters worse, he had done it without even knowing who he was. Jake ran a hand through his hair and let out a frustrated sigh. This is bad. This is really bad. Little did he know, this moment of reckless action, driven by judgment and arrogance, would be the spark that set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake Harris wasn't always a security guard. In fact, just a few years ago, he had worn a badge and carried a gun. He had been a cop in a small town just outside of Sacramento, where everyone knew everyone else, and the toughest case he ever worked was a speeding ticket. Still, it had been a good job, one that gave him a sense of purpose. At least, that's how he had seen it back then. Now, he could hardly remember what it had felt like to put on that uniform with pride. His time as a cop had been short-lived, though. After a failed drug bust, where things had gone horribly wrong and a fellow officer had been injured, Jake's career had gone down the drain. The internal investigation had found him at fault for misjudging the situation, and while he wasn't fired, the blow to his reputation was enough to make him feel like he'd failed. A few weeks later, he found himself back on the job market, with his confidence shattered. It was hard for Jake to accept that his dreams had been so easily crushed. Being a cop had been the one thing that made him feel important. Now, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He spent nights lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what went wrong. Maybe he hadn't been cut out for this kind of work after all. He found his way into a security guard position at First National Bank when he couldn't get anything else. It wasn't the same as being a cop, but at least it paid the bills. There was something comforting about the predictable, routine nature of the job. He could check the cameras, walk the floors, and ensure that no one tried anything suspicious. It didn't take much thinking, which was exactly what he needed. The truth was, Jake wasn't just struggling with his career. His personal life was also hanging by a thread. His wife, Laura, had been supportive when he lost his job, but she didn't understand the toll it had taken on him. She couldn't see how it gnawed at him, how the idea of being just another face in the crowd made him feel small. There were nights when they argued, long, bitter fights where Jake would storm out of the house, driven by a need to escape, to think. He loved Laura, but he was beginning to feel like a stranger in his own home. And then there were his kids, Sarah and Ben. They were young, just old enough to notice when things weren't right. Jake could tell they were starting to worry about him. They would ask why he wasn't as happy as he used to be, why he spent so much time staring off into space, lost in thought. He hated that they noticed. He hated that his struggles were starting to show. He didn't want them to see their father broken, even though that was exactly how he felt on the inside. There were good days, of course, days when he felt like maybe things could turn around. But those days were few and far between. Most of the time, Jake just went through the motions, doing his job, coming home, and trying not to think too much about how much he had lost. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the same man, the one who had failed, the one who had made mistakes. He wasn't sure if he would ever be able to get back to the man he used to be. When he got the security job at the bank, he hoped it would be the fresh start he needed. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make things right. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Jake realized that he hadn't found what he was looking for. Instead, he was just existing, stuck in a cycle of mediocrity. And now, with the incident involving Clint Eastwood hanging over his head, it felt like everything was falling apart once again. How could he go back to work after humiliating himself like this? How could he face his coworkers, knowing they would probably be talking behind his back? His pride, which had already taken so many hits, felt like it had taken the final blow. But there was one thing Jake knew for sure: he wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. No, Jake had never been a quitter. Sure, his dreams had faltered, and his life had taken an unexpected turn, but he wasn't done yet. He had to fix this. He had to find a way to redeem himself, even if it meant swallowing his pride and doing something he never thought he'd have to do. Jake took a deep breath as he stared at the empty bank lobby. The buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now, the silence almost suffocating. He could hear the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears, pounding like a drum, reminding him of just how deep he had gotten himself into trouble. It's not too late, he told himself. I can fix this. I just have to make things right. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and Jake turned to see Mrs. Thompson walking toward him. Her face was still a little pale, but there was something else in her expression now, something that looked almost like pity. "Jake," she said, her voice softer than it had been earlier. "We need to talk." Jake swallowed hard, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. He had no idea how he was going to fix this, but one thing was clear: he couldn't back down now. Jake stood there, trying to steady his breathing. Mrs. Thompson had returned with a look of concern in her eyes, but Jake could sense there was more to her visit than just an apology or a reprimand. His heart was still racing from the shock of the previous encounter, but now there was something else, something that gnawed at him. "Jake," she started again, her voice quieter this time, as if she were weighing each word. "You don't understand the magnitude of what you just did. Clint Eastwood isn't just some random old man who wandered into the bank. He's not here for personal business. He's a silent investor. His name is tied to this bank in ways you can't even imagine." The words hit Jake like a freight train. Silent investor. Clint Eastwood. The man he'd just tossed out like a piece of trash was not only one of the biggest names in Hollywood but also an essential part of the bank's financial backbone. He had no idea. In his mind, he had just been doing his job. It had seemed like such a simple thing: escort an unauthorized person out of a restricted area. But now he realized how wrong he'd been, and the gravity of his mistake was sinking in with every passing second. How am I supposed to fix this?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. He felt like a man who had just been handed an avalanche and was told to stop it with his bare hands. Mrs. Thompson sighed deeply, rubbing her temples. "The board is furious, Jake. They're looking into how to handle this. But it's not just about the bank's reputation. This could affect everything: our funding, our standing with investors, even our relationships with other partners. It could put all of us at risk. And that's not even mentioning the fact that you kicked out Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, without even recognizing him. The weight of the situation began to press down on Jake's chest. He had always been someone who believed in the importance of his actions, but this felt different. This wasn't just about losing his pride or his job, this was about something much bigger. He had just taken down a towering figure without so much as a second thought. How did I not recognize him? How did I not think twice? He thought, the question spinning in his mind like a whirlpool. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, Jake said finally, though the words sounded hollow in his own ears. He wasn't sure how he could possibly make things right. How do you fix something so monumental? Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow at him. You'll have to apologize, Jake. You need to go to Clint. Apologize in person. The board is insisting on it. They think it's the only way to even begin to undo the damage you've done. Jake blinked, his heart dropping into his stomach. Go to Clint Eastwood? He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. How could he, someone who had failed so spectacularly, face one of the most famous men in the world? It's the only way, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice firm. We've already contacted Clint's people, but you need to take responsibility. You'll go to him, explain yourself, and apologize. You need to do it as soon as possible, or the consequences will be severe. Jake opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The idea of going to Clint Eastwood in person made his palms sweat. What could he possibly say? Sorry for kicking you out, Mr. Eastwood. The more he thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. But then again, he had no choice. He had messed up in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend, and now he had to face the consequences. Mrs. Thompson gave him a look of sympathy. Jake, I know this isn't easy. But you need to step up. This is your chance to show that you can fix things. If you don't do this, it could cost you your job, your reputation, everything. Jake nodded, though his insides were churning. Everything was right. This wasn't just about his job at the bank. This was about his future. This was about proving to himself that he could rise above his mistakes, even when they seemed insurmountable. Later that day, after his shift, Jake found himself standing outside a posh hotel downtown. The air was cooler now, and the streets were lined with cars and people rushing in every direction, each with their own agenda, their own story. For a moment, Jake felt like he was a stranger in a world he no longer understood. He had always been a simple guy, a cop, a security guard, a husband, a father. But today, he felt like he was stepping into a different world entirely. A world of fame, power, and success. A world that was so far removed from his own struggles that it felt almost surreal. The hotel's sleek glass doors slid open as Jake walked through, and he was greeted by a friendly receptionist. Can I help you? The receptionist asked with a smile. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. I'm here to see Clint Eastwood. The receptionist raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. One moment, please. She dialed a number on the phone, and within seconds, a man appeared from a side hallway, tall, wearing a suit that screamed money, with a pair of dark sunglasses perched on his nose. You're Jake, right? He asked, his voice sharp and no nonsense. Jake nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. You're going to want to follow me, the man said, leading Jake through a maze of hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. The whole place was pristine, with expensive paintings on the walls and soft lighting casting shadows on the marble floors. It was like stepping into a dream that Jake had no business being in. They finally stopped in front of a large door. The man knocked twice before opening it. Inside, Clint Eastwood was sitting in a leather chair, looking as calm and composed as ever. He didn't seem surprised to see Jake. In fact, there was something almost knowing about his expression. Jake's throat went dry as he stepped inside. "Mr. Eastwood," he began, his voice catching. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what happened earlier today. I didn't recognize you, and I made a terrible mistake. I should have known better, and I'm truly sorry." Clint Eastwood looked up from his chair, his piercing blue eyes studying Jake for a moment. Then, slowly, he spoke. "Sit down, son. We need to talk." Jake took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was about to come next. The door clicked shut behind Jake with a soft thud, and he felt the weight of the room press down on him. Clint Eastwood's office was everything he had expected: expensive leather furniture, polished wood floors, walls lined with framed movie posters, and awards from a career that had spanned decades. It was a room built for someone who had seen and done it all. And here Jake was, a failed security guard who had mistakenly thrown him out of a bank. Clint gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, son," he said, his voice gravelly but calm, like a man who had seen it all and wasn't easily rattled. "Let's talk." Jake hesitated, feeling out of place, but eventually, he did as instructed. The chair creaked under his weight as he sank into it, still trying to gather his thoughts. His mind was racing. What do you say to Clint Eastwood after you've kicked him out of a bank? Clint studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "you've done something that no one else has ever done. You threw me out of a bank. No one does that. No one." Jake could feel his face turn red. "I didn't know who you were," he blurted out, his voice almost defensive. "I thought you were just some guy trying to break in. I was doing my job." Clint gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I get it. You were doing your job. But that doesn't mean you were doing it well. That's the problem, isn't it? You acted on instinct without thinking." Jake felt a pang of shame. Clint wasn't wrong. He had acted rashly, without taking a second to assess the situation. And now, here he was, sitting in front of the man he had thrown out of the bank. Not just any man, but a legendary figure. A man who could probably buy the entire bank if he wanted to. Clint leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. "What do you think this mistake of yours is going to cost you, huh? A job? A career? Your dignity? Or something more?" Jake's stomach churned. He had already been through so much, losing his job as a cop, trying to hold on to his family, his dignity, his place in the world. He didn't know what else he had left to lose. I don't know," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought it would go this far. I messed up. I was trying to do my job, but now I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to make it right." Clint watched him for a long moment before speaking again. "You're right about one thing. You messed up. But that doesn't mean the game is over. It's not about how you fall, it's about how you get back up. And trust me, I know a thing or two about falling." Jake's brow furrowed, confused. "What do you mean?" Clint leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I wasn't always a big shot. I started out like anyone else. Struggling to make a name for myself. I wasn't always a star. I've failed plenty of times, some of them public, some of them quiet. But I didn't let those failures define me. I learned from them. I kept going." Jake couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope, though he didn't want to admit it. He had heard stories about Clint Eastwood's perseverance, but hearing it from the man himself made it feel more real, more tangible. Maybe it wasn't too late for him, after all. Maybe there was still a way out. "I don't want to be remembered as the guy who messed up and couldn't fix it," Jake said, more to himself than to Clint. "I want to be better than that." Clint's expression softened, and for the first time since Jake had walked into the room, Clint seemed almost empathetic. "You're not the first person to mess up. And you won't be the last. But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Jake looked up at Clint, a sense of clarity starting to form. Maybe he hadn't completely ruined his life. Maybe he could still fix this. Maybe he could still prove that he was more than just the sum of his mistakes. "I'll do whatever it takes," Jake said, his voice steady now, more confident than it had been all day. "I'll fix this. I'll make it right." Clint nodded slowly. "Good. Because sometimes, the only way to move forward is to face the consequences of your actions head-on and take responsibility for them. And sometimes, you need a little help from someone who's been there." Jake blinked, not sure what Clint meant, but he nodded anyway. He had learned over the years that sometimes you had to take the opportunities that came your way, even if they seemed impossible. This could be one of those moments. "All right," Clint said, standing up from his chair. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to let you off the hook. But you're going to work with me on something. A little project of mine. You're going to learn what it means to earn someone's trust again, and not just anyone's trust. Mine." Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment that could change everything. He didn't know what Clint had in mind, but he didn't care. This was his chance. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance." Clint held up a hand, his expression now one of quiet determination. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a long road ahead, Jake. But it's a road worth traveling." As Jake stood up to leave Clint's office, he felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. He had come into that room thinking his life was over. But now, after hearing Clint Eastwood's words, he felt like he had been given another shot. It wasn't going to be easy, but he could do this. He had to. As he stepped back out into the hallway, he took a deep breath. The weight of the situation was still heavy on him, but for the first time in a long time, he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Jake's hands were clammy as he stepped out of Clint Eastwood's office. He wasn't sure what exactly had just happened, but it felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The man he had tossed out without a second thought, Clint Eastwood, for crying out loud, had just given him an opportunity to redeem himself. Not just a chance to apologize, but a full-on second chance to prove that he wasn't just some screw-up. That he could change. That he could be someone worth respecting again. But there was still a gnawing fear inside of him. A voice whispering that this chance could slip away at any moment. He had no idea what Clint had in mind for him, but whatever it was going to require him to put in more effort than he had ever given before. He had already made so many mistakes, and there was no way he could afford to make another one. Not this time. As Jake walked out of the building, his phone buzzed in his pocket. His heart jumped, and he pulled it out, his breath catching when he saw who the call was from. It was his wife, Lisa. "Hey, baby," Jake said, trying to sound calm even though his mind was still racing from his meeting with Clint. "Jake," Lisa's voice was tight, full of emotion. "We need to talk. It's about the kids." Jake's heart sank. Not now, Lisa, he thought. He didn't want to add more weight to the crushing feeling that had already settled in his chest. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady. They're struggling, Jake. They don't know what's happening. Why you're not around as much. Why we're not okay. I don't know how to explain it to them." His stomach twisted in knots. How had it come to this? "I'm trying, Lisa. I really am," Jake said, his voice thick. "I messed up. I know that. But I'm trying to fix it. I'm going to fix it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jake could almost hear the wheels turning in Lisa's mind. "Jake, I want to believe you. I do. But you've said that before. You've promised us things would get better, and it hasn't. Jake bit his lip, trying to hold back the rising emotion that was threatening to overtake him. He had failed them, over and over again. And now, Clint Eastwood, of all people, was the one giving him a chance to fix things. But was it too late? Had he lost everything? I know I've messed up, Lisa, he said, his voice shaking. But this time, I swear, I'm going to make it right. I'm going to prove it to you. To the kids. Lisa sighed, the sound carrying through the phone. I hope so, Jake. I really do. But you need to show us, not just tell us. You need to show us that you're really willing to change. Because I'm not sure how much more of this we can take. Before he could respond, the line went quiet. Lisa had hung up. Jake stood there in the middle of the street, feeling like his world had just come crashing down on him. It was one thing to screw up at work, but to fail his family? That was a whole other level of despair. His mind flashed back to Clint's words, it's not about how you fall, it's about how you get back up. Clint had been right. Jake had fallen hard, but it wasn't too late to get back up. He just had to keep pushing, keep fighting for his family, for himself. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. But the pressure weighed heavily on him. Could he really change everything? Could he be the man he needed to be for his wife and kids? The weight of his mistakes, both personal and professional, seemed to press down on him, suffocating him in ways he couldn't articulate. Jake knew he had to do more than just apologize to Clint. That was the easy part. The real work was going to be with Lisa, with his kids. With rebuilding the trust that had been shattered over the years. But before he could do that, he needed to prove to himself that he was capable of making it right. That he could be the kind of man who took responsibility, not just for his actions, but for the people he loved. Jake didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, turning over every conversation, every word Clint had spoken to him. The weight of it all was heavy, but beneath the pressure, there was a flicker of hope. He had been given a rare opportunity, and he wasn't going to waste it. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Jake was already up, moving through his routine like a man on a mission. He wasn't sure exactly how he was going to prove himself, but he had to start somewhere. Clint had told him to meet him at a local diner. When Jake arrived, Clint was already there, sitting at a booth with a cup of coffee in front of him, his cowboy hat perched on the table. Jake slid into the seat across from him, feeling the weight of the previous day's conversation still pressing on his shoulders. So, Clint said, his eyes glinting with that familiar intensity. You've got your first task. Jake took a deep breath. I'm ready. Clint studied him for a moment, then nodded. It's simple, really. You're going to go back to that bank and make a public apology. Not just a little sorry for kicking you out. No. You're going to stand in front of everyone and admit your mistake. Show them that you own it. That you're not afraid to face the consequences of your actions. Jake's stomach flipped. A public apology? That sounded terrifying. But he couldn't back down now. Not after everything. I'll do it, he said, his voice firm. I'll do whatever it takes. Clint gave him a small, approving smile. Good. This is your first step, Jake. Not just for the bank, but for your family. For your future. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of Clint's words settle on his chest. He wasn't sure if he could do this, but there was no turning back now. This was the moment that would determine everything. The moment he either proved he could change or let it all slip away. The morning air was crisp as Jake stood outside the bank. His palms were slick with sweat, and his throat felt dry despite the cool breeze. He had been here countless times before, but today was different. Today, he wasn't just a security guard standing at the door. Today, he was about to face the very people he had failed, his co-workers, the customers, and, most terrifying of all, the public. He was about to apologize for kicking Clint Eastwood out of this very building, and though Clint had made it clear that this was his first step in proving himself, Jake still couldn't shake the feeling that his life was on the line. As he stood there, watching the bank's doors open and close with each passing customer, Jake's mind raced. Was this the right thing to do? Could one public apology really fix everything? He had never been a man to make grand speeches or face a crowd with anything resembling confidence. But Clint had believed in him. Clint had given him a shot at redemption, and the only way he was going to prove that he was worth the chance was to face his mistake head-on. "You've got this, Jake," he thought to himself, taking a deep breath. "It's just words. Words you should have said yesterday. And the day before that." But even as he told himself this, his legs felt weak, and the words felt like lead in his stomach. How could he stand in front of people he barely knew and apologize for his actions without it sounding like an excuse? How could he show them that he had learned from his mistake without sounding like a broken record? He had never been one for speeches. He was a man of action, but now, the action was forced upon him. His choices had led him here, and now, he would have to face the consequences. The door to the bank opened, and Jake saw his boss, Mr. Reynolds, walking toward him. Mr. Reynolds was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the kind of boss who didn't tolerate mistakes, especially the kind Jake had made. His face was tight, eyes hard. "Jake," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice stern. "I'm not sure what you're planning, but this better not be another excuse. You've already embarrassed this place enough." Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, Mr. Reynolds. I know I've messed up. But I'm here to make it right. I'm going to apologize to the customers, to everyone who saw what happened. I'm going to take responsibility." Mr. Reynolds didn't look convinced, but he gave a stiff nod. "Do what you need to do, but remember, this isn't just about you anymore. The bank's reputation is at stake. So don't screw it up." Jake had no intention of messing this up. But as he stepped inside the bank, a wave of anxiety crashed over him. The lobby was busy, customers chatting with the tellers, the sound of phones ringing, and the low hum of the air conditioning working its magic on a hot day. Jake felt small in this moment, as if he were a child standing in front of the class for the first time. This was no ordinary apology. This was the most important thing he had ever done in his life. He walked to the center of the room, where the overhead lights shone down on him like an interrogation. Every eye in the bank seemed to be on him. He cleared his throat, feeling a lump rise in his throat as the crowd grew still. A few whispered to each other, and some glanced at their watches, likely wondering why he was standing there. It was now or never. "Excuse me, everyone," Jake began, his voice shaking just a little. He could feel the heat in his face, his palms damp against his pants. I just want to say something. I owe you all an apology. Yesterday, I made a huge mistake. I let my own fear and judgment get the better of me, and I kicked someone out of this bank who didn't deserve it. That someone was Clint Eastwood. Yes, that Clint Eastwood." There was a brief, stunned silence. Then, murmurs spread through the room. Some people chuckled, thinking it was some kind of joke. Others exchanged glances, as if unsure if they should be offended or amused. Jake took a deep breath, pushing forward. "I know that many of you saw what happened, and I know it was embarrassing. For me. For the bank. And for Mr. Eastwood. I should have handled things differently, and I didn't. I was wrong. And I want to take full responsibility for that. I don't expect anyone to forgive me right away, but I just want you all to know that I am truly sorry. I didn't think before I acted, and it cost me more than just my job. It cost me my integrity, my dignity, and the trust you all placed in me." He paused, swallowing hard as his chest tightened. He hadn't prepared for how this moment would feel, the weight of admitting his mistake to so many people. But this was what Clint had meant. He had to own it. He had to show everyone that he could be better than the man who had made that snap judgment. "And if you're wondering what happens next," Jake continued, his voice a little steadier now, "I'm going to work every day to prove that I'm more than my mistakes. I'm going to work to earn back your trust, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to make this right." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, finally, someone in the back clapped. Then another person. Then another. Slowly, the applause grew, until the entire room was clapping. Jake felt the tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, unsure whether to laugh or cry. He wasn't sure what was more overwhelming, the relief of making the apology or the overwhelming gratitude that these strangers were willing to accept it, at least for the moment. Clint Eastwood, of course, was nowhere to be found. Jake had no idea if Clint was watching from somewhere or if he'd even heard the apology. But in that moment, Jake knew one thing for sure: he had taken the first step toward changing everything. He had faced his mistake head-on, and he had started the long, difficult road toward redemption. That evening, Jake sat on the couch at home, his phone in his hand. His mind was still buzzing from the events of the day. The apology had been nerve-wracking, but it had felt right. Now, it was time to face the next challenge, Lisa. When she walked into the living room, her eyes were soft, but there was still a guarded look in them. Jake stood up from the couch, his heart pounding. "I did it," he said, voice a little uncertain. "I went to the bank. I apologized. To everyone. I owned up to what I did." Lisa paused for a moment, her gaze never leaving him. Then, to Jake's surprise, she smiled, just a little. "I'm proud of you, Jake," she said quietly. "But this is just the beginning. You've got a lot of work ahead of you." Jake nodded, his chest swelling with both fear and hope. This wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he believed it could be worth it. If he could keep proving to the people who mattered that he was worth the chance, maybe, just maybe, he could get everything back. Jake felt like he was on a tightrope, walking toward an uncertain future. The public apology had gone better than he expected, but it was just the beginning of his journey. Today was another day, another test. His first day back at work since the incident, and the weight of it all had settled heavily on his shoulders. The glare of the fluorescent lights in the bank lobby seemed more intense, the pressure of his previous mistake still palpable in the air. He had put himself out there, apologized, and tried to own his actions, but the real challenge was whether he could prove himself in the long run. The bank buzzed with its usual morning activity, the sound of keyboards clicking and customers speaking to tellers. Jake stood by the door, his usual post, but everything felt different now. It wasn't just a routine anymore. This time, he was watching, listening, reflecting. He was looking for opportunities to do better, to be better, but also to show that he wasn't just some guy who made a mistake and then hid from it. Mr. Reynolds came into the bank a few minutes later, as expected. Jake could feel his boss's eyes on him as soon as he stepped through the door. Mr. Reynolds didn't say anything right away. He didn't need to. His gaze spoke volumes. Jake knew he had to prove himself now, day in and day out. The apology was one thing, but proving that it wasn't just empty words would take much more. "Morning," Jake said, offering a smile, though he knew it probably looked forced. Mr. Reynolds gave him a curt nod. "Morning. Let's keep things professional today, all right? I don't need any more drama." "I'll make sure of it," Jake said, his voice steady. He meant it. He had to. Throughout the day, Jake's mind kept returning to Clint Eastwood's words. "This is your chance to prove you're worth it. Don't mess it up." But there were moments when doubt crept in. It had been so easy to get caught up in the notion of redemption. So easy to think that one apology would somehow make everything right. But as the day dragged on, it became clear that redemption wasn't that simple. It wasn't just about making up for one mistake, it was about proving that he could be consistent, reliable, and professional. Day after day. Without fail. Jake watched as his co-workers went about their business. Some of them were still avoiding him, not sure if they could trust him yet. Others shot him sidelong glances, probably wondering whether the change was real or just a momentary lapse of judgment. He didn't blame them. He wasn't sure how he felt either. He had no guarantees that this would work, but he was determined to find out. It wasn't until the afternoon that the first real test came. A man, dressed in a rumpled suit, entered the bank. He was carrying a large duffel bag and looked a little out of place. His eyes darted around the room, his expression shifty. Jake's instincts kicked in. Something didn't feel right. The man didn't seem like a typical customer. Before Jake could take another step toward him, Mr. Reynolds appeared from around the corner, his eyes locking onto the man with a practiced gaze. "What do you need?" Mr. Reynolds asked, his voice cold and professional. The man looked up at Mr. Reynolds, then glanced over at Jake, narrowing his eyes. "I'm just here to make a deposit," the man said, his voice too shaky for someone who had a legitimate transaction. Jake felt a familiar tension build in his chest. This wasn't right. There was something off about this guy, and he wasn't sure what it was. But he couldn't ignore the feeling. Mr. Reynolds seemed to hesitate for a moment, then gave Jake a small nod. "Jake, go check out the security footage. See if this guy's been in before." It was a simple enough request, but Jake knew that Mr. Reynolds was testing him. This was it, the moment where he either stepped up or proved that he wasn't ready. He didn't hesitate. He walked toward the security office without a second thought, focusing only on the task at hand. Once inside the small room, Jake pulled up the bank's surveillance system. His eyes flicked over the footage of the man entering the building, noticing the small movements, the way he seemed to avoid looking at the cameras. The man's behavior was erratic. This wasn't a typical deposit. Jake scrolled through the footage, scanning for anything that might be a red flag. His stomach turned when he found it, a blurry image from the previous day's footage. The same man had been hanging around the bank, but hadn't approached a teller. He had simply been loitering in the lobby. Something about this didn't sit right with him. He immediately picked up the phone, dialing the number to local security. "Hey, this is Jake from the bank. We have a potential issue. Can you send someone over?" he said, his voice calm but urgent. "There's a man in here who doesn't seem right. I need someone to come check him out." Jake's pulse was racing as he ended the call and left the room. He walked back into the main lobby, his eyes scanning for the man. He hadn't moved, still standing by the counter, looking around suspiciously. Jake kept his distance, his hand hovering over the walkie-talkie attached to his belt, just in case. He didn't want to escalate things, but he wasn't about to sit back and wait for something bad to happen. A few minutes later, a security officer from the local team arrived. He was tall and built like a linebacker, his presence intimidating. He walked toward the man, who immediately straightened up when he saw him. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. The man's eyes widened, and he glanced around the room, as if considering making a run for it. But before he could move, 2 more officers appeared at the door, blocking his exit. Jake watched, a sense of pride welling inside him. He had handled the situation. He had acted quickly and decisively, and the bank was safe. For once, he felt like he had done the right thing. For once, he had proven to everyone, including himself, that he was capable of doing his job. That he could still be trusted. As the man was escorted out of the building, Mr. Reynolds approached Jake with a brief nod of approval. "Good work, Jake," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice as dry as always. "That's the kind of thing I expect from you now. Don't let me down again." Jake's heart raced, but he managed to hold it together. He wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. He had passed the first test. But he knew there would be many more to come. Each day, each challenge, would determine whether he was truly changing or just fooling himself. Still, for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a flicker of hope. It was small, but it was there. And that was enough to keep moving forward. The days after Jake's first real test at the bank felt surreal. He had done it, he had kept the bank safe, and Mr. Reynolds had given him a nod of approval. The incident with the suspicious man had been handled with the professionalism and quick thinking Jake had longed to demonstrate. But as the days passed, the victory felt smaller than he had imagined. The praise was brief, and soon enough, the routine set back in. Jake kept his head down, doing his job with a quiet determination. He had learned to be patient, to hold his tongue when the usual complaints from customers or coworkers came up. But despite his efforts, something lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't just doubt about his performance, it was a growing sense that he was running out of time. What if this wasn't enough? What if one good day, one small success, couldn't fix everything he had broken? Lisa had noticed it, too. She had seen the way he fidgeted, the way he seemed to be running on fumes despite the good progress. That night, as they sat down for dinner, she finally decided to ask the question that had been hanging in the air for days. "Jake, what's going on? I know you're doing your best at the bank, but you're not the same. You've been off lately." Jake lowered his fork, looking down at his plate. He didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to tell Lisa that he was afraid that one day, everything would fall apart. But she was right, something was off. His nerves, the anxiety, the constant questioning of whether he was doing enough, it was wearing him down. He had apologized. He had taken responsibility. But now, the weight of what lay ahead was suffocating him. "I don't know, Lise," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "It's just. I don't feel like I've done enough. Like one mistake is too big to fix with a couple of good days. I keep thinking, maybe I missed something, maybe I could have done more. What if it's just too late? What if people can't forget what I did?" Lisa reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "Jake, you can't keep beating yourself up about this. You're doing the right things. But you've got to stop putting so much pressure on yourself. One mistake doesn't define you, and it doesn't erase all the progress you've made since." Jake stared at her hand, the warmth of her touch grounding him in that moment. He could feel her love, but he also felt his own fears choking him. "I don't know if I can keep up with this," he admitted. "Every day, it feels like I'm walking on thin ice. What if I slip up again? What if people start to doubt me all over again?" Lisa squeezed his hand, her voice soft but firm. "You're not alone in this, Jake. You've got me. And you've got the chance to make things right every single day. No one expects perfection from you, they just want to see you trying. Just keep going, one step at a time. Don't let your fear control you." Jake nodded, trying to take comfort in her words. But deep down, the fear gnawed at him. The fear that he wasn't doing enough, that his second chance was just an illusion. He had learned from his mistakes, but that didn't erase the sting of regret. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the man who had made that terrible decision, who had kicked out Clint Eastwood, the man who could have been his mentor, his ally. The next day, when Jake arrived at the bank, he did his best to push the self-doubt aside. He showed up early, standing at the entrance, as usual, with a sharp eye out for anything unusual. But even as he stood there, a small part of him was haunted by his uncertainty. What if the next test was something bigger than he could handle? The afternoon brought with it an unexpected challenge. A woman walked into the bank, her heels clicking loudly on the tiled floor. She was tall, dressed in a well-tailored suit, and her expression was one of quiet confidence. Jake didn't recognize her immediately, but something about her energy felt commanding. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the teller's desk. But it wasn't the teller she was looking for, it was him. Jake stiffened. The woman's gaze locked on him, and for a moment, he felt a flash of panic. His first instinct was to do what he'd done before, walk over, greet her, and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. But this woman was different. There was something about her that made his instincts flare. She walked up to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excuse me, are you Jake?" He nodded, not sure where this was going. "Yeah, I am. Can I help you with something?" The woman's smile widened slightly, and she extended a hand toward him. "I've been asked to come speak with you about an issue that happened here recently. I'm Sophie Kramer. I work for Clint Eastwood. You remember him, don't you?" Jake's stomach dropped. Clint Eastwood. He had barely seen Clint since the day he kicked him out. But now, this woman, this businesswoman, standing in front of him, was here because of Clint. Was this his chance to explain himself further? Or was this the moment he'd been dreading, the moment everything he'd worked for came crashing down? Yes, I remember Mr. Eastwood," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's this about?" Sophie crossed her arms, her eyes never leaving him. "Clint has been following your progress. He's been impressed with how you handled the situation with the man who tried to make a scene the other day. But he wants to know, are you ready to continue proving that you're worth the second chance you've been given?" Jake's heart raced. Impressed? Clint had been watching. Jake started, but his words caught in his throat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, and yet, it felt like the walls were closing in. "Clint wants to meet with you," Sophie continued, her gaze sharp. "He's giving you another shot. But you need to prove you're serious. If you don't, you'll lose this chance just as quickly as you got it." Jake's mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood was offering him a second chance. This was his opportunity, his shot to make up for his past mistakes, to show Clint that he could be trusted. But as much as he wanted to believe it, the fear was still there. Was he really ready for this? Was he truly prepared to live up to what Clint expected? Sophie gave him one last look, her expression unreadable. "He'll be expecting you tomorrow. Don't be late. This is your one chance, Jake." Jake barely slept the night before. The words Sophie had spoken echoed in his mind over and over again, each repetition making him feel more nervous, more uncertain. "Clint Eastwood wants to meet with me." The thought should have been exhilarating. It should have been a dream come true. But all he could focus on was how he had messed up, how one mistake could derail everything, how he could lose this opportunity just as quickly as he'd gained it. When he woke up the next morning, the sunlight barely cut through the blinds, and his stomach twisted into knots. He knew today was going to be monumental, but all he could think of was how unprepared he felt. He dressed quickly, trying to shake off the tension in his body, but it seemed to cling to him. He had never been this nervous in his life. He arrived at the meeting location, an upscale office building downtown, half an hour early, pacing outside. He could see the reflection of his own anxious face in the windows, and it made him feel even more out of place. What if Clint didn't think he was good enough? What if Clint had come to regret even giving him a second chance? The questions gnawed at him, but he couldn't let them control him. He had to go in. He had to show Clint that he was ready. After a few deep breaths, Jake finally walked through the glass doors and into the building. The lobby was sleek and modern, with shiny marble floors and high ceilings. He followed the receptionist's directions, walking down a long corridor until he reached a door that was partially open. There, in the middle of a lavish office, sat Clint Eastwood himself. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had watched Clint's films for years, admired him from afar, and now here he was, standing before the legendary actor and businessman. Clint was sitting behind a large wooden desk, a serene, almost meditative expression on his face. He was dressed in a simple but elegant gray suit, his silver hair neatly combed. The man exuded an air of quiet authority. Clint looked up as Jake entered, his expression unreadable. "Jake, come in. Sit down. Jake walked over to the chair opposite Clint's desk, trying to steady his hands as he sat. The room felt colder than it should, the polished wood of the desk reflecting the muted light from outside. Jake wasn't sure what to say. He hadn't prepared for this moment, hadn't prepared for Clint's presence to feel so imposing. Clint studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak or not. The silence stretched on, and Jake's mind raced. He opened his mouth to speak, but Clint's deep voice interrupted him before he could say anything. "Let me start by saying this," Clint said, his tone calm but firm. "I don't give second chances lightly, Jake. The last time we met, you made a mistake. A big one. But you know that, don't you?" Jake nodded quickly, his throat dry. "I do. And I've been doing everything I can to make up for it. I'm trying to prove that I can do better." Clint leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk. "Prove it," he said simply. "You say you're trying, but words don't mean much in this world. Actions speak louder. What I want to see is consistency, integrity. I need to know that you can handle responsibility, not just for a day or a week, but for the long haul." Jake's heart beat faster. He had come here hoping for some kind of guidance, some kind of affirmation that he was on the right path. But Clint wasn't handing it to him. He was challenging him. He was testing him. "I understand," Jake said, his voice steady, though he could feel the sweat on his palms. "I won't let you down, Mr. Eastwood. I've learned from my mistake. I won't make the same one again." Clint's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a brief moment, Jake thought the man was going to call it off, tell him he wasn't ready. But then Clint spoke again, his voice a little softer. "You've got guts, Jake. I'll give you that. But guts alone aren't enough. I need to know that when things get tough, when everything falls apart, you're going to hold your ground. Are you ready for that kind of pressure?" Jake nodded. "I am. I've faced tough situations before. I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like you're at the bottom. But I'm not giving up this time." Clint seemed to consider this for a moment, his gaze penetrating. "Good. Because there will be more tests. More challenges. And this isn't just about you proving something to me. It's about proving something to yourself. If you can't handle the pressure, it'll break you. But if you can rise above it, you'll earn more than just my respect, you'll earn something much greater." Jake swallowed hard. "I'm ready." For the first time, Clint smiled, but it wasn't a smile of approval. It was more of a knowing smile, as if Clint had seen something in Jake that he hadn't yet recognized in himself. "All right then," Clint said. "We'll see what you're made of. You've got potential, Jake. But you need to stop doubting yourself. Stop looking for shortcuts. There's no easy way to redemption." Jake felt a rush of relief. It wasn't exactly the warm reassurance he had been hoping for, but it was real. Clint hadn't dismissed him. He hadn't written him off. He was giving him a chance, a real chance to prove that he could handle whatever came next. Clint stood up and extended his hand. "I'm not saying this is going to be easy, Jake. But if you're willing to put in the work, you'll have my support. Don't waste it." Jake stood up and shook Clint's hand firmly. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope ignite inside him. Clint had given him a chance, not just a second chance, but a true opportunity. It was up to him now to show that he was worthy of it. Jake walked out of Clint's office feeling different. Lighter, almost, but also weighed down by the responsibility that now lay on his shoulders. He had entered that office expecting an easy answer, a simple path forward. But Clint had made it clear, redemption wasn't something handed to you. It was something you had to fight for. As Jake stepped out of the building, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he had a direction. He wasn't just trying to redeem himself for the bank, for his job. He was redeeming himself for himself. He had a purpose now. And he was ready to face whatever came next. Jake woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The meeting with Clint Eastwood had left him both shaken and inspired. As he prepared for work, he couldn't stop thinking about Clint's challenge, prove it. He had been handed a second chance, no more excuses, no more doubts. The weight of the responsibility felt heavier than ever, but there was something else there, too, a spark of determination. When Jake arrived at the bank, he didn't waste time second-guessing himself. Today was the day he was going to show Clint, show everyone, that he had what it took. There were no more distractions, no more fears about failing. He had to push past the anxiety that clung to him like a shadow and focus on doing his job with clarity and confidence. Lisa noticed the change in him as soon as he stepped into the break room. She had grown accustomed to his anxiety, to the way his mind seemed to spiral whenever a difficult situation arose. But today, he walked in with a steadier stride, his posture more confident. "Hey," she said, setting her coffee cup down on the table. "You seem different today. What happened?" Jake gave her a small smile. "I met with Clint Eastwood yesterday. And, he gave me a challenge. So, today, I'm starting fresh. No more holding back." Lisa raised an eyebrow, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Clint Eastwood, huh? That's huge. I'm proud of you, Jake." He shook his head, trying to shake off the weight of his own expectations. "It's not enough. Not yet. I've got to prove that I'm more than just a mistake I made." She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're more than that. You've been working hard. You've earned this chance. Just keep being you, okay?" Jake nodded, appreciating the support but feeling the pressure intensify. There was no room for failure now, not with Clint's words still fresh in his mind. The day unfolded like any other at the bank, but there was a distinct undercurrent of tension. Every time Jake walked through the lobby, his gaze lingered on the faces of the customers, wondering if one of them would test him. Would today be the day? Was Clint's second chance really an opportunity, or was it a trap waiting to expose his weaknesses? Around mid-morning, the door to the bank opened, and Jake's attention snapped to the figure that stepped inside. It was a man, tall and imposing, with a briefcase in hand. He wore an expensive suit, his tie neatly knotted. Jake didn't recognize him, but the man exuded an air of importance that immediately caught his attention. The man walked to the counter, speaking with the teller for a moment before his eyes scanned the room, locking onto Jake. There was something cold in his gaze, something that made Jake's instincts flare. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he was being evaluated. His heart skipped a beat as the man started walking in his direction. Jake stood tall, adopting a professional stance. This was the moment. He had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but he was determined to handle the situation without hesitation. He greeted him with a warm, yet cautious smile. "Good morning, sir. Can I help you with something?" The man's eyes never left Jake as he came to a stop in front of him. "Yes, actually. I need to speak to someone in charge." "Is that you?" Jake's mind raced. Was this some sort of test? Had Clint set this up to see how he would handle an unexpected situation? He took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "I'm in charge of security today. How can I assist you?" The man's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm here to make a withdrawal. But before we get to that, I'd like to know if you can offer me something more substantial than just a standard transaction." Jake furrowed his brow, trying to keep his composure. "What do you mean, sir?" The man's smile widened. "I need to know that the bank is secure. I need to know that someone here is capable of protecting me. What happens if someone tries to take something that belongs to me? Can you promise me that you'll prevent that from happening? Jake's pulse quickened. It was a question that dug deep into his core. Was he capable? Could he stand up and protect the bank, protect the people here? He thought back to the challenge Clint had given him. This wasn't just a test of his skills. This was a test of his resolve. A test of his character. I can assure you, sir, that we take security very seriously here, Jake said, his voice firm. We have procedures in place for every situation. And I'm here to ensure those procedures are followed. Your safety is our priority. The man nodded slowly, studying Jake. For a moment, the silence hung heavy between them, before the man finally spoke again. Good, he said, his tone still cold, but with a hint of approval. But I'll be watching you. I expect you to live up to your word. Jake held his ground. I'll do my best, sir. The man turned away, his steps echoing as he walked toward the counter, leaving Jake standing there, his heart still pounding. It was a simple interaction, but it had felt like a trial. The pressure, the scrutiny, it was all there, and Jake had passed. He hadn't faltered. He had stood tall, even in the face of uncertainty. As the man completed his transaction and left, Jake allowed himself a brief moment of relief. But just as quickly, that relief was replaced with a deeper understanding of what lay ahead. Clint hadn't been wrong when he said there would be more tests. And this man, whoever he was, had been the first of many. Later that day, Jake was alone in the break room, sitting at the table, his mind spinning with thoughts of the interaction. Had he done well? Was there something more he should have said? Just as he was about to grab his coffee, his phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Lisa. I just heard something. Clint Eastwood's office called. They're watching you. Jake stared at the message, the words sinking in. Clint had been watching him. This was real. He wasn't just trying to prove himself to his co-workers or to the bank. He was trying to prove himself to Clint, to show that he was worthy of everything he'd been given. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake didn't have time to bask in the fleeting sense of accomplishment he felt after the interaction with the mysterious customer. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine, but every moment felt heavier, as if the weight of Clint Eastwood's expectations were bearing down on him. Every time he glanced at his phone, every time he checked the time, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That something was coming, and he had to be ready. The next few days were a blur of regular workdays at the bank. On the surface, everything appeared normal. But beneath it all, the pressure was building. Jake couldn't focus on anything except the idea of proving himself, not just to Clint, but to everyone around him. He had been given a chance, and he couldn't afford to mess it up. Every customer that walked through the door, every phone call, every minor issue, it all felt like another test. And with each passing day, the bar was getting higher. Sophie noticed the change in him too. Jake wasn't just doing his job anymore, he was laser-focused, driven, almost obsessively intent on making sure everything went perfectly. It was starting to affect his interactions with her. One afternoon, as they took a break together in the break room, Sophie carefully approached the subject. You've been kind of distant lately, she said, stirring her coffee with a spoon. Is everything okay? Jake glanced at her, surprised. He hadn't meant to pull away from her. But the weight of his responsibilities was becoming all-consuming. I'm fine, just trying to stay focused. I've got a lot on my mind. Sophie raised an eyebrow. You've been saying that a lot lately. Jake, I know this is big for you, but you can't let it swallow you whole. You have to remember to breathe. Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. Sophie was right, but the truth was, he wasn't sure how to slow down. Every moment felt like it mattered, like one wrong move could cost him everything. I'm doing this for me, Sophie. I have to prove that I'm not just some screw-up. I have to show Clint that I can handle it. Sophie softened, placing a hand on his arm. You don't have to prove anything to Clint. You're doing this for you. You're capable, Jake. Don't forget that. Jake smiled weakly, appreciating her support, but her words didn't fully land. Deep down, he knew that the pressure wasn't just external. It was internal. He had set the bar so high for himself, driven by the memory of Clint's challenge. He had to show Clint, sure. But he also had to show the version of himself that had almost given up on ever being good enough. He couldn't afford to fail. Later that afternoon, Jake's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. Meet me at the usual place. 6 p.m. Don't be late. Jake's stomach dropped. The message wasn't signed, but he knew exactly who it was from. Clint had reached out. It was time for the next test. At 6 p.m., Jake arrived at a small, upscale bar in the city. The place had a dim, intimate atmosphere, with low lighting and plush booths. It was the kind of place where deals were made, where people came to be seen. As Jake entered, he scanned the room, his nerves kicking into overdrive. He spotted Clint almost immediately. The actor was seated in a booth near the back, his presence commanding even in this small, quiet space. He had a drink in front of him, but his eyes were sharp and focused as he watched Jake approach. Jake slid into the seat opposite him, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. Clint raised an eyebrow, studying him for a moment before speaking. You made it, Clint said, his voice low and steady. Let's get down to business, Jake. Jake tried to keep his composure. What do you need from me? Clint leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. This isn't just about your job at the bank. This is about who you are. I told you I was watching you, right? And I've been watching. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had known it wasn't just a metaphor, but hearing it spoken out loud sent a chill down his spine. You've been putting in the work, Clint continued. But there's something I want to know. Are you ready to make a sacrifice? Are you ready to risk it all to prove that you can handle the pressure? Jake didn't hesitate. I'm ready. Clint's gaze softened, but there was still a steely determination in his eyes. We'll see. There's going to come a point when you have to choose. When you have to decide whether you'll keep pushing forward, or whether you'll let everything crumble. And you won't know which way to go unless you trust yourself. Jake was silent for a moment, letting the weight of Clint's words sink in. There had always been sacrifices in life. He had made them before, though he hadn't realized how deeply they had affected him. But this time was different. This wasn't just a job. This wasn't just about survival. This was about proving to himself that he could rise above the mistakes of the past, that he could step into the person he'd always been capable of being. I'm not afraid of the risk, Jake said, his voice steady now. I'll do whatever it takes. Clint nodded, as if pleased with Jake's answer. Good. That's what I wanted to hear. Just then, a server approached the table, placing a drink in front of each of them. Jake hadn't even noticed Clint ordering it. Clint took a sip from his glass, then set it down slowly. But there's one more thing, Jake. A challenge for you. You're going to have to make a decision that's not going to be easy. And when that time comes, you have to trust your gut. Jake felt a flicker of unease, but he nodded. I'll trust my gut. Clint leaned back, his eyes scanning the room. I'm watching, Jake. Don't let me down. Jake could feel the weight of Clint's words pressing on him like a physical force. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It wasn't just about following rules or doing his job. It was about testing the limits of what he was capable of, and making the kinds of decisions that would shape his future. As he left the bar later that evening, Jake's mind raced. Clint had given him another challenge, another test. But it wasn't just about the job at the bank anymore. It was about Jake, about his character, about his willingness to push through the hardest moments. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: Jake was no longer just playing the game. He was living it, every moment, every decision. And when the time came to make that choice, he would have to be ready. The days following his meeting with Clint Eastwood felt like an unrelenting storm. Jake had never experienced pressure like this before. It wasn't just the bank anymore. It wasn't even Clint's expectations alone. It was everything. The pressure to prove himself, to fix the mistakes of his past, to live up to the man he had always wanted to be, it was suffocating. At work, Jake's focus became sharper, his movements more deliberate. He wasn't allowing distractions anymore. Each time he patrolled the bank's perimeter or monitored the cameras, his mind raced with thoughts of the future. Every action, every decision, had weight. It wasn't just about following protocol anymore, it was about showing Clint, showing everyone, that he could handle this responsibility. That he could stand tall in the face of adversity. But despite his outward calm, the cracks were starting to show. Late nights spent going over procedures, rechecking security systems, and obsessing over every detail were taking their toll. He was exhausted. Mentally, emotionally, he was drained. Lisa, as perceptive as always, was the first to notice. "Jake, you need to slow down," she said one afternoon, as they were sorting through some paperwork in the security office. "You're pushing yourself too hard. You're burning out." Jake didn't look up from the stack of papers he was organizing. He knew she was right, but he couldn't stop. "I can't. I've got to prove myself." "You've already done that," Lisa replied, her voice gentle but firm. This isn't healthy. You can't keep running on empty like this." Jake finally looked up, meeting her gaze. He saw the concern in her eyes, but something else too, something that struck a chord deep within him. "I don't have a choice, Lisa. You don't understand. Clint is watching me. He's given me a chance, and I can't mess it up." Lisa frowned, leaning against the desk. "Jake, I get it. I really do. But you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to take all of this on yourself. Lean on us. On me. You're not the only one with skin in the game here." Jake's throat tightened. He had always pushed people away, afraid that leaning on anyone would make him weaker. But here, in the quiet of the security office, with Lisa's eyes on him, he felt a flicker of something else. It wasn't weakness, it was the first real glimmer of trust. "I know," Jake said quietly, rubbing his temples. I don't know how to stop. What if I let everyone down?" "You won't," Lisa said, stepping closer and placing a hand on his shoulder. "But you need to take care of yourself. You're not going to be any good to anyone if you burn out." Jake nodded, but he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. What if taking a step back meant losing everything? What if he wasn't strong enough to keep pushing forward, to keep meeting Clint's impossible standards? The next morning, as Jake walked through the bank's front doors, he felt a sense of dread settle in his stomach. He had been up half the night, running over every detail in his head, unable to sleep. His mind was foggy, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up to him. It wasn't long before the first test of the day came. The bank's alarms suddenly blared, signaling a breach in security. Jake's heart raced, and instinctively, he sprang into action. But something was off. He fumbled with the control panel, his hands trembling, his mind clouded. The routine drills that used to feel second nature now seemed distant, foreign. He managed to reset the alarm, but the entire ordeal lasted far too long. Far longer than it should have. By the time everything was back under control, Jake's breath was heavy, his palms slick with sweat. His heart still pounded in his chest. A customer had witnessed the entire thing. Jake didn't recognize the man, but the sharp look in his eyes made Jake uneasy. He felt exposed, like the walls were closing in. The customer didn't say anything, but Jake knew that he'd seen his mistake. As the day wore on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time a customer walked in, every time he checked the security monitors, he felt like someone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. He was suffocating under the weight of it all, and he knew it. By late afternoon, he was on his last nerve. His mind was scattered, his thoughts disjointed. When a colleague asked him to step outside for a quick chat, Jake barely registered the request. He followed him outside, not really sure why. The cold air hit his face as they stepped into the parking lot. Jake barely noticed it, his mind was elsewhere. "You all right, Jake?" his colleague, Mark, asked, glancing at him with a concerned look. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out. He felt like he was trapped in a dream, and he couldn't wake up. I don't know," Jake stammered, running a hand through his hair. I'm not sure I can do this anymore." Mark studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Jake, you've been pushing yourself too hard. I know you want to impress Clint, but you've got to remember why you're here in the first place. You're here because you're good at what you do. But you're not going to be good at anything if you burn out." Jake's eyes glazed over as the truth of Mark's words hit him. He had been so focused on proving himself, on meeting Clint's impossible standards, that he had forgotten why he started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about Clint. It wasn't about anyone else. It was about him, about his own growth. About doing the right thing, not because he had to, but because he could. Later that night, after his shift ended, Jake sat alone in his apartment. The silence was deafening, and the weight of his thoughts hung heavily in the air. He stared at his reflection in the window, watching the dim light from the street outside flicker. He had been running from his own self-doubt for so long that he hadn't even noticed when it started to consume him. But now, in the quiet of his apartment, he realized something important: he couldn't keep pushing himself to the edge. He couldn't keep living in fear of failure, of not being enough. Clint had given him a second chance, but the real test wasn't whether he could meet Clint's expectations. It was whether he could finally meet his own. And for the first time, Jake knew what he had to do. The next morning, Jake woke up feeling a rare sense of clarity. It was as though a fog had finally lifted from his mind. The constant barrage of self-imposed pressure that had weighed on him for weeks was still there, but it didn't feel as suffocating as before. There was something different about the way he looked at the day ahead. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was running toward an inevitable failure. Jake had spent hours the night before thinking about what Mark had said, what Lisa had said, and what Clint had said. Each word, each piece of advice, had its place in his mind now, forming a puzzle he hadn't realized he needed to solve. It wasn't just about impressing Clint, or anyone else for that matter. It was about finding balance. It was about learning to trust himself and letting go of the fear that had ruled his life for so long. He had been so consumed with proving himself to others that he had forgotten the most important person to prove it to was himself. As Jake walked into the bank that morning, the usual anxiety didn't hit him like a freight train. Instead, there was a quiet sense of determination. The weight of the responsibility he carried was still there, but he didn't feel crushed by it. He felt more in control. His first task of the day was a routine security check, a task that had always been mundane but now felt like the first true test of his new mindset. Jake moved methodically through the bank, checking all the cameras, ensuring the security system was properly running. Everything seemed fine, but something was different this time. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder, afraid that the next mistake would be the one to cost him his future. He was present. He was focused. As he made his way through the back hallways of the bank, he caught sight of Sophie in the break room. She looked up as he passed, offering him a small smile. "Morning," she greeted him, her voice light. "Morning," Jake replied, offering a more genuine smile than he'd given her in weeks. He realized, then, how much he had been shutting her out. Sophie had been a constant in his life, a reminder of the person he used to be before all the pressure started. And for the first time in a while, he was allowing himself to be a little more human. "How's everything going?" Sophie asked, her voice carrying a hint of concern. Jake paused for a moment. He could have easily brushed her off with some generic answer, as he had been doing for days. But this time, he didn't. He looked her in the eye, the truth bubbling to the surface. "I'm doing better," he said honestly. "I've been thinking a lot about what matters." Sophie gave him a curious look. "And what matters to you, Jake?" Jake took a deep breath. "I've spent so much time trying to prove myself to everyone else. But I've forgotten to prove things to myself, to trust myself." Sophie smiled softly, her eyes kind. "I'm glad to hear that. You've got this, Jake." Jake nodded, grateful for her support. As he walked away from the break room, he realized just how much he had been holding back, not just from Sophie, but from everyone, including himself. The fear of failure had kept him locked in a cycle of doubt and anxiety, but now he understood that the key to moving forward wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience. It was about being able to take a hit, to stumble, and to get back up. Later that afternoon, Clint Eastwood appeared at the bank again. Jake had been anticipating this moment for days, but now, with a newfound sense of confidence, he felt more prepared. The moment Clint walked in, Jake greeted him at the door, his voice calm but steady. "Mr. Eastwood," Jake said with a nod. "Good to see you again." Clint returned the nod, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He seemed pleased, but there was a faint air of something else, something that reminded Jake that this meeting wasn't just a friendly check-in. Clint had something in mind. "You've been busy," Clint said, his voice as gravelly as ever. "I can see it." Jake nodded. "I've been putting in the work. But I think I'm starting to see things differently now." Clint raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Differently?" Jake took a breath, meeting Clint's gaze. "I've been focused so much on proving myself to you and to everyone else. But I've realized that I need to prove it to myself. I need to trust my instincts more, and not be afraid to make mistakes." Clint didn't say anything at first, but the corners of his mouth curled into the smallest of smiles. He seemed satisfied with Jake's answer. "That's the right answer, kid," Clint said, his voice low but approving. "The truth is, the people who succeed aren't the ones who never fail. They're the ones who keep moving forward, even when they do. Keep that in mind." Jake nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. For the first time, he truly believed Clint wasn't just testing him. Clint was teaching him. Teaching him something bigger than just security protocols or bank procedures. He was teaching him the value of self-belief. That evening, as Jake sat alone in his apartment, he reflected on everything that had happened. The fog that had clouded his mind for so long was finally beginning to clear. He wasn't completely free of his doubts, but he was learning to embrace them as part of the process. He didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to keep moving forward. And when the next test came, whatever it was, he would face it with a sense of calm he hadn't known he was capable of. He leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jake knew he was exactly where he needed to be. As the weeks passed, Jake began to feel like he was on the right path. His confidence grew, and with it, his ability to handle the pressures of his job. He was no longer obsessing over every little detail, and for the first time in ages, he felt like he was able to breathe. However, just as Jake started to settle into a rhythm, the universe threw another curveball his way, one that would challenge everything he had come to believe about his growth. It started with a phone call. Jake was sitting at his desk, reviewing the security footage from the previous night's shift, when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw it was Clint Eastwood. His heart skipped a beat. Clint rarely called him, and when he did, it was usually because something important was at stake. Jake quickly picked up the phone. "Mr. Eastwood," Jake said, trying to sound composed despite the rush of nerves. "Jake," Clint's gravelly voice came through the phone, low and serious. "We've got a problem." Jake's stomach tightened. "What kind of problem?" "There's been a breach. A serious one. Someone managed to bypass the security system and get into the vault." Jake froze, his blood running cold. The vault? That was the most secure part of the bank. How could this have happened? How did they get in? Jake asked, his mind racing. "We're still working on the details," Clint replied. "But I need you to meet me at the bank in an hour. I want you to handle this." Jake's pulse quickened. This wasn't a drill. This was real. The kind of crisis that could tear everything apart. "I'll be there," Jake said, his voice steady despite the panic rising within him. When Jake arrived at the bank, the tension in the air was palpable. A group of officers and security personnel were already gathered in the lobby, discussing the breach. Clint was standing in the middle of it all, looking more serious than Jake had ever seen him. Jake walked up to him, trying to keep his composure. "Mr. Eastwood," Jake said, nodding. "What do we know so far?" Clint glanced at him, his sharp eyes assessing him as if sizing him up all over again. "We know that someone got into the vault undetected. The system didn't register any unauthorized access until it was too late. We've got to find out how they did it, and fast." Jake nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. This wasn't just a technical failure. This was someone who knew the system inside and out, who understood how to exploit weaknesses. He would have to think like the thief to figure out how they did it. Clint placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, his expression intense. "This is your chance, Jake. I'm giving you the responsibility. Show me what you're made of." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Clint's words settle over him. He had come so far, learned so much, but now everything was on the line. There was no room for failure. He couldn't let Clint down. Not now. For the next few hours, Jake worked tirelessly with the security team, reviewing every angle of the breach. They scoured footage from every camera, every access point, looking for any signs of unusual activity. They ran diagnostic tests on the security systems, trying to pinpoint where the failure occurred. As the hours dragged on, Jake's frustration mounted. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There were no obvious signs of tampering, no suspicious patterns in the footage. Whoever had pulled this off was good, really good. Then, just as Jake was about to give up, something caught his eye. In a corner of the security footage, barely noticeable, was a small blip on the screen. It was a fleeting moment, an anomaly in the camera feed. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. Jake froze. He rewound the footage and paused it, zooming in on the frame. There it was. A figure, dressed in black, moving quickly through the shadows, just out of view of the main cameras. "Gotcha," Jake muttered under his breath. The next step was piecing together the movements of the intruder. Jake worked with the team to map out the figure's path. The thief had bypassed the main security doors, using a lesser-known maintenance tunnel to enter the vault area. It wasn't a route that was commonly used, and it hadn't been monitored as closely. Whoever did this knew the layout, Jake said, pointing at the map on the wall. They knew where the weak spots were. Clint, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "So, you think this was an inside job?" Jake hesitated. It was a dangerous assumption, but it made sense. The level of expertise required to pull this off suggested that the thief had intimate knowledge of the bank's security systems. "It's possible," Jake said cautiously. "But we'll need to dig deeper into the staff records and interview everyone who had access to the vault area recently." Clint nodded. Get on it. I want this solved fast. No room for mistakes. The investigation that followed was grueling. Jake and his team interviewed everyone with access to the vault, going through their backgrounds and scrutinizing every detail. The tension in the bank was thick, and Jake could feel the pressure mounting. If this truly was an inside job, the implications would be massive. It meant someone within their ranks had betrayed their trust, and the bank's security had failed them. Finally, after days of sifting through information, Jake found something. A name. An employee who had been working late the night of the breach, someone who had access to the maintenance tunnel. Someone who had recently been acting strangely, withdrawn, secretive. Jake's gut tightened as he made the connection. I think I've found our person, Jake said, his voice grim as he looked at Clint. Clint's face hardened, and he nodded. Then let's move. We need to find out everything we can, and fast. The confrontation was inevitable. The employee in question, a maintenance worker named Robert, was found in his apartment, surrounded by the telltale signs of a man who had been living a double life. Jake felt a cold sense of betrayal as he pieced together the truth. Robert had been working with an outside criminal group, using his access to the bank's systems to steal millions. But there was a twist. As they sat Robert down, he revealed that he had only been the pawn in a much larger scheme, a scheme orchestrated by someone higher up in the bank. Someone Jake never would have suspected. The shock of the revelation hit like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just an inside job, it was a conspiracy. As Jake processed the information, Clint's voice broke through his thoughts. You did good, kid, he said, his tone unexpectedly approving. Jake, still reeling from the discovery, nodded slowly. He'd cracked the case, but the truth left him shaken. The betrayal had cut deeper than he could have imagined, and it left him questioning everything. But one thing was clear, Jake had proven something to himself. He had the ability to handle the pressure. To rise to the occasion, even when the stakes were at their highest. He wasn't just following Clint's expectations anymore. He was following his own. And as the case wrapped up, Jake felt the weight of it all slowly begin to lift. He wasn't just the security guard anymore. He was the one who had solved the case. He had earned his place in Clint's world, and, more importantly, he had earned his own self-respect. The days following the breach were a blur for Jake. He was still processing the shock of the conspiracy, his mind spinning with the weight of the revelations. The news of an inside job had shaken the entire bank, and it was only a matter of time before the fallout spread beyond the walls of the building. What started as a routine security issue had now turned into a massive scandal, one that could bring down people who Jake never would have thought were involved. But as the adrenaline faded and the dust began to settle, Jake found himself in a different kind of battle. One that wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about untangling the complex web of lies and deceit that had taken root inside the bank. There were still so many questions left unanswered, and the deeper Jake dug, the more unsettling the answers became. The first task at hand was the most straightforward, finding out who else was involved in the conspiracy. Robert, the maintenance worker who had been caught red-handed, had provided some critical information during his interrogation, but he was only a small piece of the puzzle. The real mastermind behind the operation was still out there, and Jake knew that uncovering the truth would require patience and precision. Clint Eastwood, ever the seasoned veteran, had advised Jake to be methodical. Don't rush this, Jake, Clint had said after the first round of interviews. The truth will surface, but you've got to let it come to you. Be quiet. Watch. Listen. Jake had taken Clint's advice to heart, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't jumping into action immediately. Instead, he spent hours poring over the records, banking files, employee logs, maintenance schedules. He combed through security footage from days before the breach, paying attention to the smallest details. In the quiet solitude of his office, the puzzle pieces slowly started to align. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Jake stumbled across a connection he hadn't anticipated. He had been reviewing a series of security logs when he noticed a name, Tanya Michaels. She was a senior manager who had been with the bank for nearly a decade. Her record was spotless, her reputation unblemished. But Jake's instincts told him that something didn't sit right. Tanya had been involved in several key meetings in the weeks leading up to the breach, and her name kept cropping up in conversations with Robert. While she hadn't been flagged as a potential suspect in the initial investigation, Jake couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she might know more than she was letting on. He dug deeper into her activities, examining her movements, her schedules. And there it was, an unusually high number of late-night meetings with the bank's IT department. Meetings that had been scheduled with a level of secrecy that didn't quite match up with her role as a senior manager. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces were falling into place. Tanya had been more involved than anyone had initially suspected. But why? What was her motive? Jake's next step was to confront Tanya directly. He knew it wouldn't be easy, she was a powerful figure in the bank, and she had a way of commanding respect. But Jake was no longer the unsure, hesitant security guard he had been just a few months ago. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him to take a chance. It was late in the afternoon when Jake finally made his move. He found Tanya in her office, sitting behind her sleek desk, her eyes fixed on the computer screen. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Jake," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with curiosity. "What can I do for you?" Jake stood tall, his posture confident. He had no time for pleasantries. "I need to ask you a few questions about the breach." Tanya raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sudden directness of Jake's approach. "Of course, but I'm sure you've already asked all the right people." "I've been going over the records," Jake said, his voice steady. "And there's something that doesn't add up." Tanya's eyes narrowed, but she didn't interrupt. "Your name keeps coming up in relation to some suspicious meetings with the IT department," Jake continued. "Late-night sessions that don't seem like part of your regular duties. I'm just trying to understand what was going on during those times." Tanya's face remained calm, but Jake could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. She was hiding something, and he could feel it. "I don't know what you're insinuating, Jake," Tanya said, leaning back in her chair. "I'm just doing my job. Meetings with IT are normal, especially when it comes to securing the bank's systems." Jake wasn't buying it. He knew she was trying to deflect. "I've reviewed the logs. Your meetings weren't routine. They were specifically focused on the bank's most vulnerable systems. The ones that were compromised in the breach." Tanya's eyes darkened, and for a split second, Jake could see the mask crack. But just as quickly, she regained her composure. "Listen, Jake," she said, her tone turning more defensive. "I don't have time for this. I suggest you leave it alone before you get in too deep. There's nothing here. You're barking up the wrong tree." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood his ground. "I don't think I am. You can't run from this, Tanya. I'm going to find the truth, no matter where it leads." Tanya's gaze hardened, but she didn't say another word. Jake knew then that he had struck a nerve. He had the right person in his sights, but getting her to crack would take more than just words. As he turned to leave, he heard Tanya's voice stop him. "Be careful, Jake," she warned, her voice low. "Some things are better left alone." Jake stepped out of her office, his mind racing. He had no doubt now, Tanya was involved. But the question remained, how deep did her involvement go? Was she just a pawn, like Robert? Or was she the mastermind pulling the strings behind the scenes? He knew one thing for sure, he couldn't stop now. The stakes were too high, and the truth was within his grasp. All he had to do was follow the trail. And as the pieces began to fall into place, Jake realized that the world he thought he understood, his job, his life, his place in Clint Eastwood's world, was much darker and more complicated than he had ever imagined. The web was far more tangled than he could have anticipated. But Jake was ready to untangle it, no matter the cost. The following days felt like an endless game of cat and mouse. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something monumental. His mind raced, working through every new detail, every conversation, every piece of the puzzle that seemed to come together at the last possible moment. But just as he thought he had a grip on things, the pieces would shift, and new uncertainties would crop up. Tanya Michaels had made it clear that she didn't want Jake poking around any further. The warning in her voice haunted him, but he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. He spent the next few days gathering intel, quietly, carefully, keeping his head low, trying to avoid drawing attention to his investigation. His encounters with Tanya were becoming increasingly tense, but he didn't let on that he was getting closer to exposing her. Jake had learned that patience was just as important as determination. He would wait for the right moment, and when it came, he would make his move. Jake met with Clint late one evening in the bank's security room. The place was empty, save for the hum of machines and the soft glow of monitors. Clint was sitting in front of the biggest screen, his eyes scanning a feed of security footage. He didn't look up as Jake entered, but Jake knew Clint was aware of his every step. "Clint," Jake said, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "I need to talk to you about something." Clint turned to face him, his weathered face as unreadable as always. "Go ahead." Jake hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I think Tanya Michaels is involved in the breach. I've been tracking her movements, and there's too much about her activities that don't add up." Clint raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but also cautious. "You're sure?" "I'm not sure yet, but I've been digging deeper," Jake said, his voice tight with determination. "I've found discrepancies in her schedule, strange meetings with IT, and there's a pattern that suggests she's been working with someone else inside the bank. I think she might be the one pulling the strings." Clint leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "I've seen Tanya around. She's a sharp one, but I didn't think she had it in her. Still, you've got to follow your gut. If she's behind this, we need to take her down, and we need to do it smart." Jake nodded. "I need your help. I can't do this alone. If I confront her now, it's game over. She'll shut me down before I even get a chance to ask the right questions." Clint's eyes narrowed, considering the request. "All right, Jake. You're not alone in this. We'll figure out how to get the truth without tipping our hand." Jake couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time since the investigation began, he wasn't alone in the fight. Clint, for all his gruffness, was backing him up, and that meant everything. Over the next few days, Jake and Clint worked together in secrecy. Clint used his position to gather more information on Tanya's background, pulling strings and calling in favors. Meanwhile, Jake continued to monitor her movements, looking for any hint of a misstep, anything that could expose her. But Tanya was careful, too careful. It was as though she was always one step ahead. Every time Jake thought he had a lead, she'd cover her tracks, making it harder to prove anything. Then, Jake received an unexpected piece of information. A confidential memo had come through Clint's contacts, something Tanya had tried to bury. The memo detailed an upcoming high-level meeting between Tanya and some of the bank's most powerful executives, scheduled for the following week. The subject was vague, but the timing couldn't have been worse. It was a prime opportunity for Jake to get closer to the heart of the conspiracy. Jake felt a sense of urgency building within him. This was his moment. On the day of the meeting, Jake found himself pacing outside Tanya's office, his nerves frayed. He had to get access to that meeting, had to hear what was being said. He couldn't afford to let Tanya slip through his fingers again. Clint had made it clear that the best approach was to observe, not confront. "Get in there, listen to what you can, and get out clean," Clint had told him. We don't have time to waste on second chances. Jake nodded, though he could feel the weight of the responsibility bearing down on him. If he failed, everything they'd worked for would be in jeopardy. He had already planted a small recording device in Tanya's office the day before, and now he waited for the moment to slip inside unnoticed. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his palms were slick with sweat. He had never been this close to the truth before. The door to the executive meeting was just down the hall. He could hear the murmurs of voices drifting out of the room. Everything was in motion. He waited for the sound of footsteps to fade before slipping into the back hallway of the office floor. Moving quickly and quietly, Jake reached the door of Tanya's office. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. He still had a few minutes before the meeting would begin. Jake quickly checked the room, empty. His gaze swept over the desk, and there, tucked beneath a pile of paperwork, was the device he had planted earlier. He took a deep breath and pressed play. A quiet, crackling noise came through the speakers. For a moment, all Jake could hear were muffled voices, then, silence. He held his breath. Then the door to the conference room clicked open. Jake froze. His instincts kicked in, and he quickly turned off the device and slid it back into his pocket just as Tanya and a few other executives stepped into the hallway. Jake could feel the heat rising in his chest as his pulse raced. They didn't see him. They were too caught up in their conversation. Jake took his opportunity, slipping into the shadows of the corridor just as they passed. His mind was reeling from what he had just overheard. As Jake made his way back to the security room, he could barely contain his excitement. The pieces were finally coming together. He had heard enough to know that Tanya Michaels wasn't just an accomplice, she was at the center of the entire operation. She was the mastermind behind the breach. And it seemed that she wasn't working alone. There were higher stakes at play here. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, influence, and control. The conspiracy ran deeper than Jake had ever imagined, and now, he was more determined than ever to bring it to light. By the time he reached Clint's office, Jake could barely contain himself. "Clint," he said, his voice steady but charged with urgency. "I've got it. Tanya. She's the one behind everything. And she's working with people higher up than we thought. We've got a whole lot more to uncover." Clint leaned forward, his face hardening. "You're sure?" Jake nodded. "She's been playing us the whole time. But now we've got her." Clint's eyes locked onto Jake's, and for the first time, Jake saw something else in Clint's gaze: respect. "All right, Jake," Clint said, his voice low and resolute. "Let's take this thing down." Jake's hands were shaking slightly as he sat at the desk in the dimly lit security room, replaying the recording again and again. Tanya Michaels. The woman who had walked through the halls of the bank with a reputation for excellence, trustworthiness, and competence. She wasn't just involved in the breach, she had orchestrated it. But as Jake listened to the hushed conversations from the meeting, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. Clint's words echoed in his head: "This isn't just about money, it's about power." Jake had never truly understood the significance of that statement until now. The breach wasn't an isolated incident or a one-time lapse in security, it was a carefully calculated move to manipulate the bank's assets, to steal control over something far bigger. Someone had been pulling strings from the shadows, and Tanya was just the tip of the iceberg. There were bigger players, more dangerous forces involved, and Jake now found himself in the middle of it all. The next morning, Jake met Clint outside the bank's main entrance. Clint had a rare, grim look on his face. The usual glint of mischief in his eyes was absent, replaced by a quiet, deliberate focus. "Got a plan, Jake?" Clint asked, his voice low and serious. Jake nodded. "Yeah. But we need more than just what I've heard. Tanya's working with someone higher up, and she's been in touch with people who, well, they're dangerous." Clint's eyes narrowed. "I don't like where this is going, but you're right. We've got to take her down, and we need to make sure we have all the evidence before we make a move. Jake glanced at his watch. The board's having another meeting tomorrow afternoon. If we're lucky, that'll be the perfect opportunity to get more information. Clint stroked his chin thoughtfully. We'll need backup. This is no longer just about an internal breach. If the higher-ups are involved, this could get ugly fast. The plan was set. Jake and Clint would stake out the boardroom meeting, hoping to find clues that would lead them to the masterminds pulling the strings. But they had to be careful. Tanya would be on alert now that she knew Jake was onto her. She wouldn't let him catch her off guard again. As the clock ticked closer to the scheduled meeting, Jake and Clint hid in plain sight, blending in with the shadows of the office building. Clint had his usual bag of tricks, disguises, gadgets, and an uncanny ability to blend into the background. They had been through tight situations before, but this one felt different. This time, they were up against an adversary that wasn't just trying to steal money, they were trying to seize control of something much more powerful. And Jake couldn't let that happen. The boardroom was located on the top floor of the building, and it was heavily secured. Jake and Clint made their way to the elevator shaft, carefully timing their movements to avoid being detected. They would have to make their way in through the back entrance, past the security checkpoints and into the heart of the operation. Jake felt a cold sweat forming as they approached the door to the boardroom. This was it. This was the moment that could make or break everything. Clint gave him a nod. You ready? Jake gave a firm nod in return. Let's do this. With that, Clint pressed a hidden button on his watch, activating a small device that temporarily disabled the electronic lock on the back door. The door creaked open quietly, and they slipped inside. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The executives were seated at the long, polished conference table, their voices low but urgent. Jake couldn't make out the specifics of their conversation from his vantage point, but he didn't need to. The very presence of the people in that room told him everything he needed to know. Tanya Michaels was sitting at the head of the table, her posture commanding. But the faces around her were all unfamiliar to Jake, businessmen and women who radiated an air of authority, people who had to be part of the higher-level conspiracy. Jake and Clint crouched behind a large potted plant just outside the door, hidden from view. They both kept their eyes trained on the scene inside. It was clear this wasn't just a corporate meeting, it was a gathering of the masterminds behind the entire operation. They were finalizing plans, coordinating their next move, and discussing their next steps in their pursuit of power and control. Clint whispered, "We need to move fast. We don't have much time." Jake agreed, but as he continued to watch, his thoughts were racing. If they made a move now, they could catch Tanya and the others off guard. But that would mean going up against people with far more power than they were prepared to face. The risk was enormous. Just then, Tanya stood and spoke, her voice cutting through the air with authority. "The money's in place," she said coldly. "We just need to push the final phase forward. The accounts are set, the key players are on board, and all that's left is for us to take control. Once that's done, we'll own everything. No one will be able to stop us." Jake's stomach churned. Take control. Those words rang in his ears as he realized the true depth of the conspiracy. This wasn't about just stealing money, it was about manipulating the entire banking system, pushing people like Jake and Clint aside, and seizing power on a level he hadn't even imagined. As the conversation continued, Jake and Clint exchanged quick glances. They couldn't stay hidden for long. The walls had ears, and Tanya's careful words were meant to confirm her involvement in the heist, but they were also a signal. She wasn't just stealing from the bank, she was preparing for a larger-scale takeover. Jake whispered, "We need to get to that back file room. If there's anything incriminating, it's there." Clint nodded, his expression tight with determination. "I'll cover you. Let's move." With swift movements, they made their way to the back of the building, where the file room was hidden behind layers of security. Tanya and the executives were too engrossed in their meeting to notice, and this time, Jake felt a rush of confidence. They were on the verge of discovering something massive, something that could bring everything crashing down. As Clint disabled the security system to the file room, Jake's mind raced. Every decision they made now could lead to disaster, or victory. Clint gave him a sharp look. "Ready?" Jake nodded. "Let's end this." They entered the room, and in moments, Jake was flipping through files, his eyes scanning every document, every transaction. His pulse quickened as he found what they were looking for, a series of detailed documents outlining the illicit transactions, plans to manipulate stock prices, and instructions for blackmailing key figures in the banking world. "Clint, look at this," Jake said, his voice tight with disbelief. Clint stepped over to him, looking at the papers. His eyes widened. This is big. Bigger than I thought." But as Jake reached for more documents, a sudden noise from behind made his heart stop. Footsteps. Fast, purposeful. Someone was coming. Jake's heart raced as the footsteps drew closer. Every instinct told him to run, to escape before they were caught. But there was no time. Not now, not when they were this close to ending it all. The files in his hands felt like the weight of the world, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. He looked over at Clint, who was standing near the door, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. There wasn't much time left. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. Someone would be entering the file room any second now. "Clint," Jake whispered urgently. "We've got to get out of here." Clint didn't say anything, but his expression was grim. He moved quickly, grabbing the last of the documents Jake had found and shoving them into a bag. There was no turning back now. They needed to move fast. The door to the file room creaked as it began to open, and Jake's pulse skyrocketed. He had no idea who was coming, but the fact that they were this close to being discovered made the stakes higher than ever. He couldn't afford to make a sound, to make a mistake. "Clint, now!" Jake hissed. Clint nodded, and without another word, he sprinted toward the back door of the room, his movements fluid and fast. Jake followed close behind, his legs burning with the effort, adrenaline flooding his system. As they darted down the narrow hallways, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed behind them. Jake's mind raced with one singular thought: escape. They had to get out before anyone saw them. Clint led the way, pushing open a hidden door that led to the back stairwell. They were on the lower levels now, making their way through the maze of service corridors. It felt like an eternity before they finally made it to the underground parking garage, the safe haven where they could regroup and get out of the building. Jake could feel the weight of the documents in his hands, proof that the conspiracy went deeper than he'd ever anticipated. And yet, as they made their way to the exit, the relief he felt was short-lived. Clint slammed his hand against the elevator button, and the doors slid open. Without speaking, they both stepped inside, their eyes locked onto each other. "This is it," Clint said, breaking the silence. "This is the moment we either walk away or take them down for good." Jake's gaze never wavered. He was done playing it safe. They were too close to the truth now, and he wasn't about to let anyone stop him. "We'll take them down," Jake said, his voice low and full of resolve. "I'm not walking away from this." The elevator dinged as it reached the basement level, and they stepped out into the cold, concrete garage. Clint's car was parked in the corner, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As they made their way to the car, Jake felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. The danger they were facing now was unlike anything he'd encountered before. But there was no turning back. They had the documents. They had the evidence. Now, they needed to get it to the right people. Jake's mind was already racing with the possibilities. Who could he trust with this? Who could they go to that wouldn't be compromised? The first name that came to mind was Agent Hudson, the FBI contact who had helped Jake when things first started spiraling out of control. She was reliable, and she had been skeptical of the bank's operations from the start. But could they trust her enough to hand over everything they had? Clint broke through Jake's thoughts with a question. "You think Agent Hudson's still on our side?" Clint asked, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Jake nodded slowly. "She's the one person I know we can trust. If she's still with us, she'll help us take them down." Clint didn't say anything else as he floored the gas pedal, the car speeding toward the exit of the underground parking lot. They were heading straight for the FBI office, and Jake could feel the tension in the air. They were so close. But in the world they were playing in now, one wrong move could mean the end of everything. As they neared the FBI headquarters, Jake's mind flashed back to everything that had led up to this moment. The late nights spent reviewing footage, the countless hours of tracking Tanya's movements, the quiet whispers in the backrooms of the bank. Every step had brought them closer to this. But what if they weren't ready? What if they walked into a trap? "We can't afford to hesitate," Jake said aloud, more to himself than to Clint. Clint's eyes flicked to him, his expression unreadable. No hesitation. Just action. The car pulled into the parking lot of the FBI building, and Clint cut the engine. They sat there for a moment, the weight of the decision settling between them. Finally, Clint spoke. "You've got this, Jake. Let's make it count." Jake took a deep breath, then opened the car door. "Let's go." Inside the FBI building, Jake and Clint were met by Agent Hudson, who was waiting for them in a quiet conference room. Her face was calm, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes when she saw the bag Clint was carrying. "You've got something," she said quietly, her tone serious. Jake nodded. "It's all here, everything we've been working on. The full operation. Tanya Michaels, the executives, everything." Hudson's eyes narrowed as she glanced at the documents in Clint's hands. "This is bigger than we thought. You know this is going to cause a firestorm, right? There's no turning back once we hand this over." "I know," Jake said, his voice steady. "But it's time. We need to take them down." Hudson nodded, her expression determined. "I'll get the right people in place. You two did good work. But now, we need to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. We'll expose them. And we'll make sure they're held accountable." As Hudson left to make the necessary arrangements, Jake and Clint sat in silence, the weight of what they had just done sinking in. The documents were in the right hands now. The battle wasn't over, but they had just taken the first, most crucial step. Jake leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "It's done," he said, his voice full of quiet relief. Clint smirked, his eyes glinting with pride. "Not done yet. But we're on the right side now." Jake looked out the window, watching the city lights blink in the distance. The truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before the pieces of the conspiracy would fall into place. But for now, Jake had won the first battle. The war was far from over. The weight of their actions hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, and Jake couldn't shake the sense of unease that gnawed at him. The FBI had the evidence, everything they'd risked their lives for. Yet, as he sat across from Clint in the dimly lit waiting room of the FBI headquarters, he couldn't quiet the nagging feeling that things weren't quite over. "How long do you think until we hear something?" Clint asked, his voice tense as he bounced his leg restlessly. He'd been quiet since they handed the files over to Agent Hudson, but Jake knew Clint was just as anxious as he was. Jake ran a hand through his hair. "Hard to say. Hudson said she needed to move fast, but with something this big, it's going to take time." His eyes narrowed, and his mind raced. "But we're not just fighting against a couple of people. Whoever's behind this has a lot of resources. We might be walking into a bigger mess than we think." Clint's eyes glinted with a sharp edge of concern. "That's the understatement of the year. These people are smart, they've been covering their tracks for months. Maybe longer. You don't pull off something like this without serious muscle behind you. Jake's fingers drummed against the table as he nodded slowly. Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. The way everything lined up, how smoothly it all seemed to run. It wasn't just about getting money. It was about control. Power. The door to the conference room creaked open, and Agent Hudson walked in, her face set in a firm, unreadable expression. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, and as soon as she sat down, she placed a thick stack of documents on the table in front of them. The investigation is underway, she said, leaning forward. Her tone was grave, and the weight of the situation was evident in her eyes. We've already moved on some of the people involved, but there's more to it than we expected. Jake felt a tight knot form in his stomach. More. Hudson nodded, her voice lowered. We were able to verify the initial findings, but this is bigger than we thought. We've got a network of people involved in this, not just the bank. Real players with international connections. The conspiracy is reaching farther than anyone realized. Clint's eyes flashed with concern. What kind of connections are we talking about here? Global, Hudson said flatly. This goes well beyond a few executives and a bank. Some of the names in these files lead to corporations, government officials, even foreign entities. We're looking at a coordinated effort to manipulate the global financial system. Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. His worst fears were coming true. What they had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. The people they were up against weren't just criminals, they were masterminds with the ability to pull strings at a scale Jake couldn't even fathom. Do you have anyone in custody? Jake asked, trying to steady his breathing. His heart was pounding in his chest. Hudson hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the folder. A few, but not the ones calling the shots. The people we need are still out there, and they're taking steps to cover their tracks. It won't be easy to bring them in. Clint shot Jake a sidelong glance, his jaw clenched. So, what now? You've got all this evidence, but we're still chasing ghosts. Hudson's expression softened, though only slightly. Not exactly. We're closing in on key players. But I need you two to be prepared for what's coming. Whoever is behind this won't go down without a fight. The next few hours passed in a blur. The tension in the room grew palpable as Agent Hudson and her team worked through the files, analyzing the evidence Jake and Clint had provided. The fact that they were sitting in the FBI headquarters, playing a pivotal role in unraveling a global conspiracy, seemed almost surreal to Jake. It wasn't the kind of world he ever thought he'd be part of, but here he was, fighting for something bigger than himself. Clint leaned back in his chair and glanced out the window. This doesn't feel right, he muttered. I have a bad feeling. These people have resources, maybe more than we realize. Jake didn't respond right away. He had the same sinking feeling in his gut. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. They had just uncovered a network of corruption that extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The stakes were higher than they could have anticipated, and even though they had the evidence, they were still facing the unknown. And the worst part? They weren't sure who they could trust anymore. Later that night, Jake was alone in his apartment, sitting in front of his laptop. His mind raced as he sifted through the files once again. Something felt off, something was slipping through the cracks. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper layer to the conspiracy that they hadn't even touched on yet. His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from Clint, "Meet me at the usual place. I've got something." Jake's heart skipped a beat. What was Clint talking about? He stared at the message for a moment, then grabbed his coat and headed out the door. The usual place was a small, nondescript diner on the outskirts of town, one that was frequented by anyone trying to stay off the grid. Jake slid into a booth in the back, his eyes scanning the room until he saw Clint sitting alone in the corner. Clint looked up as Jake approached and motioned for him to sit down. "We've got a problem," Clint said quietly, sliding a folder across the table. Jake opened the folder, and his eyes widened as he looked at the contents. Inside were new names, new locations, more evidence. But this time, it wasn't just about financial manipulation. The new files revealed a deeper layer of corruption, military contracts, shady dealings with foreign governments, and more. "This goes deeper than we thought," Jake muttered. "These people aren't just interested in controlling the financial system. They're building an empire. And we're just scratching the surface." Clint's eyes were filled with grim understanding. Exactly. Whoever these people are, they're playing a much bigger game. And the FBI doesn't even know the full extent of it yet. Jake closed the folder, his mind reeling. "So, what do we do now?" Clint leaned in, his voice low. "We need to act fast. Whoever's pulling the strings is watching, and they know we're getting close. We've got to find out who's really behind this, and take them down before they take us down." As Jake left the diner, his heart pounded in his chest. He knew that their next move would be crucial. They were getting closer to the heart of the conspiracy, but time was running out. The storm was closing in, and Jake didn't know how long they could stay one step ahead. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to bringing everything into the light. The world outside the small, dimly lit diner felt like a distant memory. Jake sat in his car, staring at the streetlights as they flickered like small, fading stars. The revelation they had uncovered in the last few hours had been too much to process. The conspiracy wasn't just a financial scheme anymore, it was a dangerous global network, one with the power to manipulate governments, control the military, and destroy anyone who stood in their way. Jake's phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Clint: "Get to the warehouse. We have a plan." A plan? Jake felt the pit in his stomach tighten. This was it. The moment they'd been preparing for. The moment they either took everything down or risked losing everything. When Jake arrived at the warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Clint was already waiting for him, a look of determination on his face. The large, unmarked building loomed in the darkness, its windows blacked out, as though hiding some kind of secret. It was the perfect place for a final showdown, a place to confront the people behind the conspiracy. Clint motioned for Jake to follow him as they walked through the large steel doors. Inside, the air was thick with tension. A team of FBI agents was already in position, moving silently, checking their gear, making sure everything was in place. But despite the preparation, Jake could sense that they were all nervous. They were walking into the heart of the storm. "Everything set?" Jake asked Clint, his voice low. "Everything's in place," Clint said, his jaw tight. "Hudson's got backup on standby. We're going to move in once we have the intel." Jake's eyes narrowed. "And what if this is a trap?" "It could be," Clint replied, glancing at the agents around them. "But we don't have a choice. We either take them down now or risk letting them disappear with everything." Jake swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct told him that this was their only shot, but the stakes had never been higher. The people they were up against had the power to make them vanish without a trace. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Jake felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cold, empty hallways, each step amplifying the tension in the air. Every door they passed was another potential threat, another moment where everything could go wrong. Clint led the way, and Jake kept close behind, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at his side. He didn't want to use it, but he wasn't going to let anyone stop them now. They had come too far. Finally, they reached the main room of the warehouse, a large, open space filled with crates and equipment. But it was the people standing in the middle of the room that took Jake by surprise. Tanya Michaels stood there, her arms crossed, a smug smile on her face. But it wasn't just her, several high-ranking officials from the bank, along with a few unknown figures, were all gathered together, watching them. "Well, well," Tanya said, her voice cold and calculating. "You really thought you could take us down, didn't you?" Jake's stomach churned as he looked at her. He had never trusted her, but to see her standing there with such confidence, knowing the chaos she had caused, made the weight of their mission feel even heavier. "You're done, Tanya," Clint said, his voice steady. "We have everything. The evidence. The truth. And it's going to come out, no matter what you do." Tanya's smile only widened. "You think you're the first to try," she scoffed. "You're nothing. Just pawns in a much bigger game." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Who's pulling the strings? Who's behind all of this?" Tanya's eyes flickered for just a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're asking the wrong question," she said cryptically. "You should be asking how you're going to survive the storm that's about to hit." The tension in the room thickened as Jake's mind raced. He knew they were standing on the precipice of something dangerous. But just as he was about to speak, the sound of a door slamming open echoed through the warehouse. The agents positioned at the far side of the room rushed into action, weapons drawn, but something was off. There was no sense of order, just chaos. A figure appeared in the doorway, a tall man dressed in a sharp suit. It was someone Jake had never seen before, but his presence commanded attention. "I think you've overstayed your welcome," the man said with a calm, menacing tone. The air around them seemed to freeze, and in that moment, Jake realized that everything they thought they knew had been a lie. The man wasn't just another player in the conspiracy, he was the one who had been orchestrating it all. "Who the hell are you?" Clint demanded, his hand inching toward his gun. "I'm the one who owns this game," the man said with a sinister grin. "And now, it's time for you to play by my rules." The room erupted into chaos. Shots rang out as the FBI agents attempted to surround the group, but the man in the suit was quick. His men, well armed and prepared, began firing back, forcing everyone to scatter. Jake ducked behind a nearby crate, his heart racing. He could hear Clint's voice calling out, trying to organize the agents, but it was clear, this wasn't going to be an easy fight. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and surrounded. But Jake wasn't ready to give up. He knew this was the moment that would determine everything. He couldn't let these people get away with it. He couldn't let them continue their reign of terror. Jake peeked around the crate, his eyes locking onto the man in the suit. He was too far away for a clear shot, but Jake knew he had to take a risk. "Clint!" Jake shouted. "Cover me!" Without waiting for a response, Jake sprinted across the room, weaving between crates, trying to stay low. The sound of gunfire rang in his ears, but he couldn't focus on that. He had one goal, the man in the suit. As he neared the figure, Jake saw the look of surprise in the man's eyes. He hadn't expected Jake to be this bold. "Not so fast," the man sneered, raising his gun. But before he could fire, Jake dove forward, knocking the gun out of his hand. The two men collided on the ground, struggling for control. "Who are you really?" Jake grunted, pinning the man's arms to the ground. "Who's behind all of this?" The man smirked, his lips curling into a cold grin. "You'll never know. Some secrets are too dangerous to uncover." Jake didn't wait for him to finish. With one swift motion, he pulled the man's gun from his holster and fired, hitting him in the leg. The man howled in pain, but Jake wasn't done yet. "You're going to talk," Jake said, breathing heavily, "and you're going to tell us everything." The fight continued to rage on around them, but with the man incapacitated, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. They were winning. They were finally going to bring the truth to light. And maybe, just maybe, they would make it out alive. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?